Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and once again I am joined by
Drachinifel.
And so this is just us getting around to the Q&A segment, which we, did sort of Drydock style under my videos, and so we're just going to be going through answering the questions as best we can. Some of them are probably more Drachinifel speed, some of them maybe more my speed. I'm sure we'll be able to answer. Hopefully, we'll be able to answer them between the two of us.
Yeah, see, this is what happens when you put a pinned post for Q&A underneath the video.
Yeah, it's quite the obligation. So we'll start with first question. This is from Tully DT, and this is one that I'm not going to fully understand, but you probably will. Do you consider the direction of the direction Romulan Doctrine took, or at least elements of it, to be equivalent to real-life cruiser submarine concepts, where large caliber guns were mounted on large, long-distance submarines, e.g. the French submarine Surcouf?
In a way, in a way, some of the Romulan Warbird design does reflect that, at least in the way it's executed on screen. Obviously, as we discussed in the third episode, the intent of the Romulan Warbird was to have a bit more 360 or maybe at least 270-degree fire arcs, as opposed to the kind of all-forward attack which we ended up seeing on screen. But for what we actually see on screen, the kind of decloak, drop in, blast everything in sight, and cloak again, is somewhat similar to some of the concepts that are seen in cruiser subs, albeit that I think if there was any submarine that most closely parallels the Romulan Warbirds as seen on screen, it's probably actually HMS M1, because the Surcouf and X1, HMS X1, which are actually more realistically the cruiser subs, they were designed to spot something, then come to the surface and have a full-on gunnery duel, and or just travel around on the surface and have gunnery duels with the option of hiding if they needed to. Whereas M1 is a submarine that just has a massive gun attached. Surcouf and X1 as cruiser subs were designed to sail around on the surface, engage if it was favourable, and then dive away if not. Or they could pop up and engage, but when they popped up, they had to clear the guns. Whereas M1 was a 12-inch ex-battleship gun stuck on a sub. It was very much, at least for its seaborne use, because it was supposed to be a submersible monitor, depending on which particular doctrine you believed. But it was more designed to just pop up, deliver a couple of really punishing heavy rounds, and then disappear again. Which is more along, weirdly enough, it's more along the lines of what we hear the Romulans doing, but not what we see them doing. Because outside of maybe one or two instances, on screen we see the Romulans decloak, come in decloaked, fight, and leave. But when we hear about, in spoken dialogue, they do seem to have this hit and run where they just pop up, shoot, and scoot again.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of, depending on what your capabilities is, obviously this is going beyond the Duridex, but as the kind of the main example, it's worth bearing in mind, you've got more than just your disruptors. The Romulans have various forms of torpedoes that they can use, and that gives them some better range. And it's also worth saying that while Romulan ships are not maneuverable, at least resurrected starships, in one of his videos, he describes that the Duridex could still basically accelerate to an attack speed, get a vector on an enemy starship, just charge headlong, decloak at still a decent range, maybe mid-range, dump all of its weapons, overshoot the target, and then dump all of its rear weapons, and then cloak.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a little bit more involved than just decloak, fire, recloak, and rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably something you would do if you had a smaller ship, if you had like a bird of prey of some description, something small and agile with which can't take a hit and has a very powerful but slow recharging weapon, and it only has one weapon.
Yeah.
Then that kind of, sort of whack-a-mole, pop up and fire tactic is perhaps more applicable there.
Yeah, I think the one problem with drawing parallels between cruiser subs and the Romulans, at least from the naval way of looking at things, is that the submarines, because they have a relatively low height above the water once they're surface, they actually have severely restricted firing range for their guns compared to a surface ship, because the surface ship can just physically see further. So the submarine's guns can actually fire a lot further than the submarine can actually spot the fall of shot or see any targets, which was one of the many reasons why cruiser subs didn't tend to work out too well. Whereas obviously in space, actually being cloaked, which is the equivalent of being submerged, I guess, is a position from which most of the time you actually get significantly more advantage, because you can see there's no sort of line of sight issues in space. You can see everything and your opponent can't see you. So there is a little bit of a slight boring analogy there, but it's loosely parallel, but I wouldn't say it's directly comparable.
Yeah, well, because also when you're decloaked, you are on the same level as the starship. So yeah, there isn't that disadvantage that there is. Okay, so I think we've answered that quite satisfactorily. Another thing he asked, this is more of a joke question. Were the prototype Breen ships, when they were designing the Breen ships, do you think they just used broken Beyblades?
It does kind of look like that, doesn't it? I mean,
yeah.
I know we mentioned at the time, but I think the Breen ships, to me, they almost look like someone was either making a set of Gould transport rings or possibly something that resembles a mad gyroscope, and then it broke, and then they slapped it back together, and they're like, well, it'll do.
That'll do. Yes. I mean, on the more technical aspect, I think the Breen ship, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Breen ship is completely CGI. I don't think there ever was a physical model because it appears so late into Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, which would explain some of the weird scaling issues you get sometimes.
Yes. Yes. There's a whole thing. I settled that. I settled that. That's another video. I'll put that in the link thing. Yeah, if you're concerned about the size of the Breen ship, go look there, because I did work it out.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Next question from Frackin Gaius Baltar. Are there no carriers? So with regards to carriers in Trek, or this is because we said there's no point doing Second World War because there's no carriers. Are there no carriers in Trek because basically every ship has a carrying capacity?
Almost every ship carries shuttles. So theoretically, yes. Although the way that shuttles are used, I would say they tend to be more analogous to helicopters.
Yeah,
and we don't say that every modern ship is a carrier just because almost all modern frigates and destroyers happen to carry helicopters.
Helicopters, yeah, that was exactly where I was going to go with that. Or you could even say, if you want to confine it to the sort of 1890s, didn't most large ships have little rowboats?
Yeah, all ships have boats, and then later on, World War I, World War II, people would start to have catapult launch planes, and they could have a few of those. I think, and of course, you've got things like the Akiras, which theoretically have quite a large carrying capacity.
Yes. Or even actually the Galaxy class, because of that massive saucer shuttle bay, which we never see.
I think the larger problem when it comes to carriers in Star Trek outside of beta or gamma canon, with things like the computer game that gives you USS Typhon and some of the Starfleet battle stuff, but in main canon, well, part of it is obviously, if you want to talk about real life, it's to do with budget.
Yes.
That's why the transporter was invented, because they didn't want to have to animate the shuttles going down. So, let alone, here's a battle scene between these two extremely intricately detailed, 6-foot models that we've built. And we're going to reuse ad infinitum. Oh, and by the way, we also want you to incorporate like 4 dozen tiny fighters zipping around. Yeah, I don't think TNG would have survived more than a couple of seasons if they'd had to do that every time.
No.
You would have ended up with hilarious amounts of stock footage.
Yes.
But I think if you're talking in pure within universe terms, I think the largest issue with fighters and therefore having carriers to launch them is probably because of the single biggest limitation to capital ships facing off against fighters and bombers and torpedo bombers and so forth in real life was the fact they had to carry this entire dedicated set of guns just to try and deal with the fighters and the other attack aircraft. Their main armament was useless, whereas in Star Trek, your phasers and disruptors and polaron beams, etc., are far from useless against fighters.
Yes, although the kind of I literally have just done a video responding to Law Reloaded, or at least to come out at this point, on the fighters. I make a defense, and one of the things I bring up is yes, you can easily biff them with your capital ship weapons. Is it worth wasting the shots on them though? When perhaps you have a more pressing threat closing in at the same time. That was one of my main arguments.
I think it probably depends on the type of ship, because something like let's say a Vorcha, which has a lot of heavy forward firepower, but it's almost fixed. A bunch of fighters that can get in behind it and harry it will probably actually have a fairly long survival time. And even against something like the Defiant, because the Defiant has one occasional all-round phaser beam. And other than that, everything else is forward-facing. Now, it's fairly agile, but a fighter, in theory, should be even more agile. But if you're talking about the big capital ships, especially Federation ships, which tend to have all-round phaser coverage, when you see in something like Nemesis, when the Enterprise E is just questing for a hit, by blasting off in all directions and so forth. That kind of rate of, or actually when the Enterprise D is going to town on the Borg cube in Best of Both Worlds, that kind of rate of fire and numerous phaser emitters, in theory, you could cut a swathe clean through fighter wings like the No Tomorrow, actually, which you kind of actually see in the episode where the Enterprise D's crew were hypnotized or brainwashed. They just blitz straight through a wave of attack craft in about 4 seconds. But what I just really want to quickly remind everyone, because they may have forgotten, that this is also the episode in which Riker sleeps with Ensign Ro. I just want to remind people that was a thing that happened. You're a cruel and unusual master. So I think now the interesting thing, at least in my personal headcanon, is that pretty much the first time you see a large-scale deployment of Federation fighters, as opposed to the occasional showings they have in the Badlands and such like, is at the Sacrifice of Angels.
Yes.
Now,
where they are.
Yeah, now, one of the things I noticed during that is it comes up when Cisco tries to get communications up and running, and O'Brien says that everything's jammed because the Dominion are generating a rotating EM pulse, which is just a fancy way of saying someone's sitting there with a very powerful transmitter and sliding their finger up and down the frequency dial. But, and I thought, well, hang on a minute. So this is really the first big fleet battle we've seen in Star Trek. And basically what it's come down to is jamming is a thing.
Yes.
And I thought, now for my headcanon, that allows in large battles for the use of fighters, because in small battles, where no one really has a massive electronic warfare capability, in theory, you should be able to blitz fighters out of the sky if you're attacking a large starship with 360-degree firepower. But in a large-scale battle, if someone's really badly messing with your communications and sensor systems, and presumably both sides are degrading each other's systems, that might actually degrade your targeting systems enough that your big phaser and disruptor beams and spiral wave disruptors or whatever can't actually get reliable locks on these small, fast-moving targets.
Yes, and they themselves may have countermeasures, and the main defense against fighters would be, well, to an extent, would be formation and coordinating fire between your neighboring ships. And if you can't do that, then suddenly you've got to handle all these targets on your own without shooting the guy next to you.
Yeah. And you kind of see both ends of the argument in that first incoming attack wave, because one of the galores just absolutely nails a peregrine, just slices it clean in two, but then the next 2 or 3 blasts miss completely.
Yes.
So, yeah, I would suspect that, sort of putting that all together in my head, that the reason we don't see fighters too often outside of the big fleet battles where they have this sort of this easy get-out clause, and more specifically the carriers, is probably because in small-scale engagements, if you're up against an opponent with 360-degree main weapons and you don't have the kind of mass there to generate significant electronic warfare capabilities, they're probably very vulnerable, which means that carriers are a weapon that is only applicable in very specific circumstances, at which point you either wouldn't build them and just rely on, as you said, starships with their own carrying capacity, just collectively bringing everything to the front when needed. Or if you do build carriers, they're probably just, big flying boxes of supplies, essentially, and they're just probably sitting in some reserve fleet unit during peacetime. Because while there may be circumstances, like if you're the Romulans, you're probably thinking, look, a carrier might be really good to use against the Klingons, because the Klingons love their forward firepower. But if you do that and then you think, but the Federation have loads of 360-degree firepower, so we're basically investing all our time and money into building this frontline warship that's only useful against one of our enemies.
One enemy, yes, when you want to be able to adapt to the rapidly changing situation of the Alpha Quadrant.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've covered that pretty thoroughly. The next question by Fracking Gaius Baltar is size creep in Star Trek inevitable, like in real life? And where is the cutoff? Where is the cap?
Well, it does appear to be, doesn't it? Because if you, at least lengthwise, because the Enterprises get progressively longer, and then once you depart from Alpha Canon, you get into Star Trek Online, the Enterprise F is bigger than the E. And you skip a few letters up to the J that we see in Enterprise, and that's bigger still. So, yes, size creep is a thing, but I think there's 2 elements to it. One is the Enterprise is the Federation flagship. As technology improves, you can build bigger and bigger. Your flagship is not going to be some diminutive, pint-sized craft. So you're probably always going to see that the Enterprise is the pinnacle of Federation technology. And to be fair, the Sovereign class, although it's longer than a Galaxy, is actually overall smaller. It masses less. So I think that there's that caveat to bear in mind. But I think also there's I think the other thing I would mention is that you do see in real life, and I suspect you've probably also seen in Star Trek, what I call the occasional reset. Because, so destroyers originally are supposed to be attack craft and escorts. And then they grow and grow and grow They go from a few hundred tons to 1,000 tons to 2,000 tons to nowadays when they're 10, 12,000 tons. So a modern day destroyer is now effectively part battleship, part cruiser in where it sits in modern naval hierarchies.
Yes, yeah.
And as a result, destroyers were the anti-sub escorts of World War One, and while they are to an extent the anti-sub escorts of World War Two, they've gotten too big and expensive, so you get corvettes and frigates brought in, and now the frigate is the anti-submarine escort.
Yes,
it's smaller than the destroyer, but even frigates these days are 3, 4, 5, 6,000 tons or more, even though they started out at the same sort of few hundred to low 1,000 tons that the destroyers did. And in the modern Royal Navy, at least, you got the Type 26 frigates, and now they're bringing in Type 31 and Type 32 frigates, which have dialed the size down again. So I think you kind of, in some ways, you kind of see things following. Hopefully, everyone knows what I'm talking about when you talk about a Jacob's ladder.
I think so.
It's kind of the two separating bits of metal that have electrical arcs going up it, and the arcs obviously get wider until they break at the top.
Right, okay.
And when you switch on, you just get this constant, which is why it's called a ladder. It looks like a series of electrical arcs forming rungs that move up, get larger, pop off, and then the whole thing starts at the bottom. And I think, to a certain degree, that's what naval technology follows. A certain ship, a certain class of ship starts out at a certain size, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's no longer sustainable. And then something else comes in at the bottom as a cheaper, easier way of doing that role. And then that gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's too big, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so it's sort of almost like, a bottom up. Expansion.
I think you see this in Star Trek as well, because if you think about a Miranda and a Constitution and then an Excelsior, so they're kind of your original series ships.
Yes.
But then, whilst, yes, you have your ambassadors, your galaxies, and your sovereigns, and your nebulas in both TNG, DS9 era, you're also now seeing Sabres and Defiance and so forth. So you see small ships coming at that lower end again.
Yes. Yeah. The other thing I was going to say in terms of just a basic level cap, this is probably going to get demolished by Star Trek Online.
Mm-hmm.
There's no helping that. Some of the ships are just hideously large. Some of them are right and restrained. I was just recording a video for one of them today, and it was actually very sensible and restrained. But in terms of like cannon, I would say your size cap for a fighting ship is somewhere around about 1,500 meters, maybe up to 2,000 meters. But if you look at like the very biggest ships, which actually we don't see getting bigger, or at least in that same way, or that same level of bulk. I'll send this chart because most of the things that are huge are not combat vessels. They're either like the Voth City ship, which is, a floating colony, or a Borg cube. Again, another kind of floating colony, or cargo ships or whatever. The fighting ships seem to cut off at around about some point under 2,000 meters.
Yeah. And I think in part, to be honest, it's also about putting all your eggs in one basket, because when you think about it, the number of ships present at the big fleet battles, you're talking about hundreds upon hundreds of ships, a good number of which are carrying what you would call full-scale capital weapons, your Type 10 phasers or your quantum torpedo launchers, stuff like that. And the bigger ships, like the Jem'Hadar battleship or the Negvar or whatever, outside of the odd things like, the siege guns on the Negvar or whatever, most of them tend to seem, it seems that their solution is to just mount more of the same weapons. I mean, you see that with the scimitar. The scimitar doesn't, apart from the stupid claw of death. It doesn't have any other uniquely powerful weapons. It just has a metric ton of them.
Yes, again, for them, you could say the same actually of the Dominion battleship, although it does have the siege guns. What we actually see it using is endless volleys of torpedoes.
Yes, and this is the thing, is like if you make a really big ship, it seems that outside of massive fixed siege cannons, at least the Star Trek of the 24th century doesn't seem to have any your Type 20 phaser or whatever to stick on these massive ships. And so you've basically got a single hull that's just carrying a small fleet's worth of firepower. But if you invest all your resources into building a few of these things, your opponent can turn up with several hundred more regular-sized ships. And if you've got ambassadors and galaxies and nebulas and so forth, and they're all toting the same caliber of weapon, just fewer, but there's more of them, you just end up getting mobbed.
Yes, and you're the bigger target as well.
There's the fleet size. I think the fleet sizes in Star Trek are such that I think it imposes a certain cap on the size of ships, because once they get past a certain size, they become so big, so obvious, and so few that the massive fleet the enemy has will just go, we'll just focus fire on it, and it lasts all of 4 seconds.
Yes, I mean, and that is ultimately, like, even with something like the Borg, that basically is what was happening in First Contact in that battle. It was not in good shape, even when the Enterprise first shows up. It had sustained a fair portion of damage. It was still working, but it had taken a bit of a pummeling.
Yeah, and ultimately, in terms of resources, personnel and resources consumed constructing, I suspect the loss of that cube hurt the collective in terms of your balance sheet a heck of a lot more than however many Starfleet ships it crippled or destroyed.
Yes, I'm just now imagining Borg doing a spreadsheet.
Well, at some point they would have assimilated someone with a knowledge of Microsoft Office. But yeah, I mean, and I think this is the thing. Yes, it's the Battle of Sector 001 is a huge tragedy for Starfleet in terms of they lost a lot of ships and a lot of personnel, and the Borg are technically a much larger power than them, so they can have more cubes. But I suspect on a mass destroyed basis, the Battle of Sector 001 was probably materially a Federation victory by quite a long margin. Yes,
I would say so. The next question from fucking guys Batar is, how would a jeune école style fleet work in space?
Hello, Klingons.
So that's something that makes sense to you? Not a clue.
Okay, so the jeune école was a French idea in the latter part of the 19th century, because they spent the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and part of the 70s trying to match or exceed the Royal Navy and outbuild them in both numbers and latest technology. And it turned out they couldn't. Every time they tried, the Royal Navy just caught up with them incredibly quickly and then overhauled them. So they, for a while, gave up on the idea of trying to compete one-on-one, and they adopted this new idea, which was the jeune école, which effectively held that because of the recent invention of the torpedo, which then allowed a much smaller ship to deliver a potentially deadly blow to a much larger vessel, and you could build a lot more of these small ships for the price of one large capital ship. The idea was that you would have a fleet of these small, cheap torpedo craft, which could then sink the big, expensive battleships of your opponent, and you'd maintain a fleet of cruisers to go and harass their trade and shut down their economy. And the idea was you win by economic strangulation and disproportionate firepower. Right. It didn't work.
No.
because they forgot the one cardinal tenet of any kind of idea like that, which was if you build a bunch of small, fast attack ships, your bigger opponent can build an equal or greater number of small, fast attack ships and still have a regular battle fleet. So if you mutually annihilate each other, then they still have the big battle fleet, so they win. Plus other things like self-defense weapons and so forth. So yeah, it didn't really work out for the French. But having just explained it, in the end, you look at things like the Vorchas, hit and fade, big firepower, but not really able to go toe to toe with some of the bigger ships in their weight class, or the Burrells, which basically do the same thing. Small, fast, hit and run, cripple or destroy, then flee, and hope to take down much larger prey. The Klingons are basically, until the introduction of the Negvar in the TNG era at least, they're playing a Je ne Cole fleet style.
Oh yeah, definitely with when they're having to run the cavort as well, because that's literally just all they have. Yeah, the only other kind of, after you explained it to me, the only other one I thought of was the Dominion, again prior to the introduction of the battleship.
Yeah, I think with the Dominion it depends on exactly what we want to credit the Dominion and cruiser with. I know before we said it's probably more of a Vorta transport with a massive torpedo volley, but it's not really that suited for full-on fleet combat. But yeah, I think the Dominion possibly, but certainly the Klingons. Yeah, and to be honest, it doesn't really work out all that well for the Klingons.
No, well, they spend most of the pre-TNG era just being the Romulan punching bag.
Yeah, and to be honest, for all the fact that they went full on aggro on the Cardassians, the fact that they were still trying to take and beat down Cardassia, having committed, I think, what was a third of their fleet.
Yeah,
months later, when Ducat finally enlists Dominion, it's just like the Cardassians are not exactly difficult to beat if you're a top tier power, and the Klingons like to imagine themselves a top tier power, and then they commit a third of their forces, and months later they're still trying to beat the Cardassians down.
Oh man, I don't know who that reminds you of. But I want to cut them a little bit of slack there, because the reason that they didn't conquer Cardassia was a political decision by Gowron. He was saying, okay, we won't completely conquer Cardassia, we'll stop here at our gain line, and that's that. We won't advance any further and completely obliterate the Cardassians. So there is I'm not saying that the Klingons could have completely defeated the Cardassians, but the main problem was the political machination.
Yeah, but then how much of that was Gowron adapting to the situation? Because he seemed initially, certainly in Way of the Warrior, they seemed to be very much hell-bent on completely taking over Cardassia. Warheap even says that they'll take over Cardassia, they'll install a puppet government. That's what happens. This is how the Klingons do war.
Yeah,
and then you have the events of Way of the Warrior, and then Gowron's like, as you just said, he's like, well, actually,
we're going to adapt the objectives of our special operation.
Yeah, sailing a bit close to the wind with modern politics, but it's almost like our special security operation against Cardassia Prime is over. We are now going to refocus our efforts in Phase 2 of the Klingon-Cardassian border.
Yeah.
Honestly, this is what we meant all along, guys.
Yeah. That was surprising, but I think that is perfectly accurate. It's just it's like, I guess, poetry, it rhymes. Who'd know? His last question is, you tell him a little bit more about this Italian ironclad torpedo boat mothership thing.
Oh, yeah. So Well, is that just a general question, not Star Trek related? He just wants to know about.
He just wants to know a little bit more about it.
Okay, so in the 1870s and 1880s, the Italians were being very inventive because they just invented Italy. Up until then, it had been a bunch of different states. So they were kind of on a bit of a roll. And this, all the foundation of Italy as a country actually almost, not exactly, but almost coincides with the opening of the Suez Canal. So you simultaneously now have a large-ish European nation with a reasonable amount of funding who is entirely focused on the Mediterranean, because everyone else, the French have got the Atlantic coast and the Channel coast, the Spanish have got the Atlantic coast, the British have kind of adopted everybody's coastlines and the Mediterranean. And Northern Africa is either belongs to bits of it belong to the Ottoman Empire, other bits are small countries with not a tremendous amount of resources. Greece is still under Ottoman control, although not for too much longer at this stage. And then you have the Ottoman Empire itself, which kind of thinks it's of itself quite big, but one, they've got to face off against the Russians in the Black Sea, and two, they really are not doing very well.
No.
They're just limping along. So Italy is kind of the only power that's got a monofocus on the Med. And with the importance of the Med suddenly ramping up, because it's now, with the Suez Canal, the main throughput route to the Far East, the Italians start to build a series of warships because they realize that they can build them, but they can't build anywhere near enough to ensure domination of the Mediterranean, because the British have got the Mediterranean fleet there, the French have got their ships there. To be honest, those are the two main fleets you have to worry about. But so the Italians are looking for ways of getting an individual qualitative edge. And when they build some of their ironclads, one of the ideas they have, because the torpedo and the torpedo boat to carry it has kind of come about at this point, is that battleships are still fairly slow. So if for a battleship to gradually wallow its way into torpedo range, it could take a while. It's not guaranteed it'll succeed, and people will probably shoot it a lot on the way in. But the torpedo boat has the problem of, it's great, it's fast, it's difficult to hit, it carries torpedoes, it has a nice big punch, but they can't really go very far because they're so small. They don't have a lot of fuel. And so the Italian solution to sort of square this circle is that because their own capital ships don't need to go tremendously far, because they're mostly Mediterranean only, they decide, well, instead of having loads and loads and loads of coal bunkers the way that everyone else has to, we can dedicate some of our space aft. And they basically put a little hangar on the aft end of some of their capital ships, into which they stick a torpedo boat or two, with the idea that basically it launches lifeboat style off of the back, RNLI style, down a little ramp. And then, so in battle, you could have the battleships going back and forth, and then suddenly it's launching, this little torpedo attack craft, which hopefully, ideally, can just rush in and deliver a torpedo strike before the enemy can get out of the way. And even if it doesn't, or if it gets hit on the way in, or if the enemy sees it coming, they will at least be reacting and firing at that instead of the battleship, in which case the Italian battleship now has free reign to do what it wants.
Right. That's funnily enough, because that does kind of remind me of a beta cannon ship that I've been using called the Chavakal, which is a Klingon carrier. It basically mounts the one of the Vochar modules, the fighter module, the carrier module, but on its front. Whereas the Vochar has it on its back. But essentially, the idea of that is that it will, unlike other carriers, or your more conventional carrier, which it would stand off because this is a Klingon ship, it's going to fly right at the enemy, far away with its weapons. It's not got the most powerful weapons, but it's got enough weapons to, cause a spot of bother, and then just barf up these fighters right into the face of the enemy.
So it's a similar kind of concept, and there's also another similar one in the original Flavor Odyssey class in Star Trek Online, with its little Aquarius class attack ship.
Yes, it slides out the back.
Yeah, and that is almost to a T exactly what the Italians are planning to do. So yeah, I guess that answers that question.
Okay. That's quite good.